Good evening. We are going to be continuing our study here in the book of Psalms tonight. I hope that you can join us by turning in over to Psalm 20. Psalm 20 will be the first one we look at. We have about three that we are going to be looking at tonight. I hope that they're beneficial to you. I mentioned to you last week that I'm considering the idea of stopping going through individual Psalms and moving over to the book of Proverbs. I am still considering that. I haven't received any feedback, either positive or negative, for that move. A little feedback would be okay. If I don't get any feedback, I'll make the decision and try to inform you guys in the not too distant future, hopefully by the end of this week. If you are for it, let me know. If you would rather continue staying in the book of Psalms, let me know. I hope if this is being beneficial. I don't want to end this study prematurely. If you think that this has run its course and it's time for us to move on to something else, let me know. If you're just particularly interested in Proverbs, let me know. We're going to be looking at Psalm 20 tonight. Let's go ahead and read Psalm 20 together. Psalm 20, starting there in verse 1. To the choir master, a psalm of David. May the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of the God of Jacob protect you. May he send you help from the sanctuary and give you support from Zion. May he remember all your offerings and regard with favor your burnt sacrifices. May he grant you your heart's desire and fulfill all your plans. May we shout for joy over your salvation, and in the name of our God set up our banners. May the Lord fulfill all your petitions. Now, I know that the Lord saves his anointed. He will answer him from his holy heaven, and with saving might of his right hand. Some trust in chariots, and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. They collapse and fall, but we raise and stand up. The Lord, O Lord, save the King. May he answer us when we call. Psalm 20 and Psalm 21 actually work together in a pair. Sometimes they're called royal psalms. Ironically enough, or just the way my mind works, I'm planning on going through Psalm 20 tonight. I don't plan on going through Psalm 22. I hope that isn't too much of a faux pas. But Psalm 20 and 21 both deal with kind of the same topic. These are psalms, as we see here in Psalm 20 and 21, written by David. The first one here in Psalm 20 is written for the people to plead, both David and the people, to plead for the health and the safety and the protection and the guidance of the king of Israel. And Psalm 21 is a psalm of thanksgiving when God has done this. And so they work in conjunction in that way. So if you want to see the fulfillment of what is requested here in Psalm 20, look over in Psalm 21. But David writes, from the perspective of the people of Israel, writing on behalf or writing to God or speaking to God on behalf of their king. And he says here from verses 1 down through verse 5, he begins each line with the word may. May the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of the Lord, the God of Jacob, protect you. And this is a psalm of blessing, a request of blessing. This is a great way whenever we read over in Timothy that where Paul says he desires for men in every place to lift up holy hands to God, and that offerings or prayers and intercessions and thanksgivings be made for all men. Psalm 20 is an excellent example of a prayer for of intercession, a prayer for providence for individuals. And so here is this request, verses 1 down through verse 6. Or sorry, 1 through 5. May the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. I don't know always when trouble is going to be in your particular life. All the things that are going on with you. And this is a wonderful request of may God answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of the Lord, God of Jacob, protect you. May he send you help from the sanctuary and give you support from Zion. We have looked at other psalms as well where the psalmist is extolling God. We looked at Psalm 18, I believe it was last week, where David writes that when the Lord did answer, that he, in his distress, Psalm 18 verse 6, in my distress I call upon the Lord, to God I cry for help, and from his temple he heard my voice, and my cry to him reached his ears. And then the earth reeled and rocked, and foundations of the mountains trembled. This is the request in Psalm 20. The answering is in Psalm 18, and the people's thanksgiving for it is in Psalm 21. I find it interesting that all of those work together. And so he says, may he remember all your offerings and regard with favor all your burnt sacrifices. And again, we can tie in a couple more, at least one more psalm, to kind of give an understanding of this. Psalm 51 is the psalm that, it's cashews, it's not coronavirus. Psalm 51 is the psalm that David writes after he's confronted by Nathan the prophet, after he goes into Bathsheba. And he mentions here that God will not delight in his sacrifices, that God will not approve of all his burnt offerings. And the answer isn't because he just hates David or that he hates sacrifices, it's that David's heart was wrong. And so he mentions here in Psalm 51 that create in me a clean heart and renew a right spirit within me, verse 10, and then cast me not away, restore me to your salvation, and then I will teach transgressors your ways, in verse 13, and sinners will return to you. And then he says, in verse 16, for you will not delight in sacrifices, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with burnt offerings. For the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, and a broken and contrite heart, O God. These you will not despise. Do good in Zion, and in your good pleasure, build up the walls of Jerusalem, and then you will delight in right sacrifices and burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. There is this conditional understanding that as you get into Psalm 51, that for God to find all of his sacrifices pleasing, that the heart has to be right. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit and a broken and contrite heart. And then after that, the sacrifices are acceptable. And so part of the request here in chapter 20 is not that God would accept any sacrifices under any condition, but that David as their leader, or any of the leaders that thereafter that this psalm is going to be speaking about, that their heart would be fully and wholly towards God. And so he says here in verse 4, may he grant you your heart's desire and fulfill all your plans. We're going to be looking at this in our last psalm of tonight, and I think that as we look at the last psalm, it's going to give us a better understanding of what it means here that may God grant your heart's desire and fulfill all of your plans. The idea isn't that God just gives the king anything he wants. If he wants, his neighbor's wife, God isn't automatically going to be okay with that and pleased that he happens to have Bathsheba. In fact, that is the exact opposite. The heart's desire, as we're going to be looking at later, is the desire should already be for God and for his law and for his people. And that God would grant the desires of the king's heart that are correct. And then he mentions here the last may, or the last two mays in verse 5. May we shout for joy over your salvation in the name of our God. Set up our banner, and may the Lord fulfill all your petitions. This is a request not only for their leader, but also for them as a people, that they all kind of united would be able to benefit from God's plan being fulfilled, and that there be joy in their life for it. And he now then makes this statement in verse 6 and verse 7, or actually 6 down through the end of the chapter, that salvation comes solely from God. He says, I know that the Lord saves his anointed, and he will answer him from his holy heaven with the saving might of his right hand. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord. There is an irony that there are no atheists in foxholes, that whenever hardships come, we have a tendency to turn to God when all the chips are down, and whatever other phrase you want to use. And then whenever salvation comes, whenever everything washes out and you walk away mostly okay, to feel proud that you have done it, or to feel reliant on the things that you used during that time period to get out of that scrape. And yet, here, what we are taught to do is to believe and act diligently, knowing that it is God's salvation. And that's going to be important. I mean, it's going to be important at every aspect of our life and every point in time in our life is when do we ever view our salvation as our own? I'm not talking just about spiritual salvation, our getting out of any tight spot, our ability to provide for ourselves, or our ability to plan for the future and that plan to come to fruition. He's dealing here in chapter 20 with the whole idea that whatever comes about, it comes about through the ability of God. And some trust in chariots and some trust in horses. Some trust in the might of our American military. Some people trust in their bank accounts, as we look over in 1 Timothy chapter 6, who trust in the uncertainty of riches. But we should be individuals who trust in God. He mentions here for others in verse 8 that they collapse and fall, but we rise and stand upright. May the Lord save the King, and may he answer us when we call. And as I mentioned, Psalm 21 rather, is the people rejoicing over answering the request of Psalm 20. So if you would like to read that, feel free to take some time and read that. But this Psalm 20 is a great example of what it would be to a great example of a prayer that leads to us requesting great things from others, or for others, I should say. Turn with me a couple pages over to Psalm 24. Psalm 24. This section of Psalms is kind of there's a whole smattering of ones that we know fairly well. We know Psalm 19. We know Psalm 22 that Jesus quotes on the cross. 23 is probably one of the most universally well-known Psalms. And so I wanted to kind of pick out a couple Psalms in the middle of all that kind of famous area to highlight. Psalm 24 is a beautiful psalm. I don't say unfortunately falls on the heels of Psalm 23, but it is far overshadowed by Psalm 23 because of Psalm 23's popularity. It is every bit as good as Psalm 23, in my opinion. So Psalm 24, let's go ahead and read Psalm 24 together. He says, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. For he has founded it upon the seas, and he established it upon the rivers. Who shall ascend to the hill of the Lord? And who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false, and does not swear deceitfully. He will receive blessings from the Lord, the righteousness from God of his salvation. Such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek the face of God of Jacob. Lift up your heads, O gates. Be lifted up, O ancient doors, and the King of glory may come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord, mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates. Lift them up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory." Psalm 24 is somewhat similar to Psalm 15 that we looked at, I believe it was last week or the week before last, where he asked the question that who shall stand before God? In Psalm 15, there in verses 1 down through verse 5, he says, "Who shall sojourn in your tent, and who shall dwell in your holy hill?" The same kind of question comes here as we look down into verse 3. Before we get there, he mentions here that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and the world and those who dwell in them. To us who believe in a monotheistic, a single God creator, this seems to be a well-done statement. But it is completely profound in what it conveys to us. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. When it comes to his salvation or his protection, when it comes to his providence, when it comes to him sustaining and providing, who else is there to turn to? Well, it's certainly not me. It isn't even to a group of people. It isn't to a humanitarian society. It isn't even to our government. All of it is created by God and for God. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and the world and those who dwell in them. As you look through the history of the Bible, and God says, I'm going to raise these people up, and I want to send them here, and for you, I'm going to judge and cast you away into a foreign nation. We've been dealing with that on our Tuesday night classes throughout some of the minor prophets. As you go through the time period, the kings and all the promises that God makes, and you get to the very beginning of Acts, and you can pick out wherever you want to, and God makes promises of what he's going to do in this world. Understanding that for him, those are all small things. To make it and then just to manipulate, that is a very small thing for God. And there's a reason as you get over into Matthew chapter 6, and Jesus says when it comes to the things that you put on your body, what you're going to eat, what you're going to wear, the roof over your head, that we shouldn't be anxious about those things, that we shouldn't worry about those things, for your heavenly Father knows that you need all of them, and by your worrying, you can't add a single hour to the span of your life. You can't. There's a reason that we turn to God. There's a reason that we look to him for all that we have and all that we hope to do in the future. He is the only source. And because the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. As a complete side note, 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and in verse 26, Paul quotes Psalm 24 and verse 1. He uses this verse in the context of food that is clean. He mentions this in the context over in chapter 10 when it comes to the cleanliness of food. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness of thereof. If he chooses that this food is clean, then it's clean. I mean, that's the point that he makes. But he mentions here the Lord founded the earth in verse 2. And if that's the case, if God made everything, well then who, in verse 3, shall ascend to the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? Back in Psalm 15, David had some answers there as well. Here in Psalm 24, he'll have a couple more answers. He says, he who has clean hands. The cleanness of hands has nothing to do with germs. It has nothing to do with a worldwide pandemic, even though that's where our minds might come to. It has something to do with someone who carries Purell in their pocket or even washes diligently with soap. The whole concept of cleanliness of hands deals with the individual who is innocent. The same wording, same phrasing-ish comes up in Psalm 26. And in verse 6, for me it's on the same opening. I wash my hands in innocence. It comes up again in Genesis chapter 20 when Pharaoh is defending himself against God, or rather against God's accusations or God's challenge for having Sarah. And he says, in innocence I took her because Abraham said that she is my sister. And the idea, that same wording is there in Genesis chapter 20 and verse 5. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 8. Because he says here in Psalm 24 and verse 4, he who has clean hands and a pure heart. Matthew chapter 5, there in verse 8 is the Beatitudes. And he mentions here, blessed are the poor, pure in heart, for they shall see God. This isn't a completely new idea here in Matthew chapter 5. This is an idea that Jesus and the Holy Spirit had inspired for David here in Psalm 24. Well, who shall stand in the holy city or holy place? Who shall ascend to the hill of God? Well, it's him who has a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false or idolatry, to a false god, and does not swear deceitfully. Those things are hugely important. The honesty that we have in ourselves, the honesty we speak with our mouth, the desires of our heart, all of that is extremely important if we want to see God. Sometimes we get in this routine of talking about the plan of salvation and the steps that are required for that, and we deal with the function of them, the speaking aloud of the gospel so that others can hear, the response of what shall I do to be saved, the confession that I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and then the actual action of baptism. And sometimes we gloss over the heart of the person. It'd be so easy just to find a big body of water and just wait for people to come by and chuck them in if that's how it worked. But it doesn't work that way. It's all about the person themselves and the choices that they make. And that's what he's dealing with here. Who gets to be in God's presence? It's him who has clean hands and a pure heart and doesn't swear falsely. In this individual in verse 5, he will receive blessings from the Lord and righteousness from God of his salvation. Getting back into the Beatitudes, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. He's dealing with that concept here as well. Individuals who receive this blessing from God because they desire righteousness from him. And he says here in verse 6, such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek the face of God of Jacob. We've been we've been looking at Amos on our Tuesday night studies, and if you have free time on Tuesday nights around 7, we've been going through some of the minor prophets, and you're more than welcome to join us on Tuesday nights as well. But Amos deals here with a very similar concept of seeking God in Amos chapter 5. He mentions it 3 times in that chapter, in verses 4, 6, and then later on in verse 14, to seek God. Paul mentions this as he's speaking in Acts, that God desires those who seek him and feel their way towards him, and yet he's not far from each one of us. God calls, and that's undoubtable. I mean, the wording is there throughout the entire Old Testament and New Testament that God calls a people. But that choice to respond is still ours. There's a reason that Amos came to Bethel and he began to preach to the people and he encouraged them to seek God. Their choice. God knows where they are. He has given them his covenant. He has provided for them priests. He has gone through the whole ordeal, the whole history of Israel in order to call them. They needed to seek him in return. David here speaks of individuals who seek the Lord. Paul speaks of the same thing as he's there in the Areopagus, that he desires people to seek him. And he says here in Psalm 24 and verse 6, such is the generations of those who seek him, who seek the face of God of Jacob. And then he speaks verses 17 through verse 10 in this repeating fashion. We use this in modern poetry as well, where we introduce an idea and then we repeat it to emphasize it. And so he uses very, very similar phrasing in verses 7 and 8, repeats that back again in verses 9 and verse 10. Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, so that the King of glory may come in. 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and in verse 8, Paul refers to Jesus as the man of glory or the God of glory. But the idea being here is, here we have this gate that guards us from all kinds of things. Whatever you want to put in that terminology for what we're guarded from. But we can't be guarded from God. If we want to dwell with him, if we want to have clean hands and a pure heart, if we want to be people who don't swear falsely, we can't be guarded from him. We have to open those gates. And there are things, I'm sure, in your life, much as there are things in my life, that I hope to never have to speak of again. Things that I hopefully are my past, things that have happened and I've been repented of, and things I've been forgiven of, things that I've just seen that I just don't desire to ever talk about in the future. We are guarded usually to some degree from the people that we interact with on a regular basis. There are things that happen between husband and wife that never need to be mentioned before other people. Those things need to be held in honor among married individuals. There are all kinds of things that we just don't speak of to others. There are things that we guard ourselves against. But when it comes to God, that shouldn't be the case. And David here repeats this twice to really emphasize this, that you need to lift up your heads, O gates, you need to be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. And who is this King of glory? Well, it's the Lord. He's strong and mighty. It's the Lord who is mighty for battle. And so he repeats again in verse 9, lift up your heads, O gates, lift them up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. And the question comes up again, who is the King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory. There's an old saying that you should never keep secrets from your lawyer or from your priest. The priest one is, obviously not what we're talking about. And the lawyer is just kind of a comical thing. Good advice, but not what we're talking about. Do you try to keep secrets from God? Are the things that you don't discuss with him, that you don't reveal to him, that you don't try to exercise out of yourself through the process of prayer and study? I would suggest that most people, for a large part of their life, they do that. And one of the beautiful things about studying Psalms is the study of how to exercise those feelings and thoughts to God in a way that maybe we didn't understand that we were encouraged to or allowed to in the first place. We need to be unguarded before him. Everything should be on the line. We are hoping to be individuals who are fully cleansed and fully redeemed. And we need to allow those gates that we guard ourselves so diligently to be open to God, so that the Lord of glory may come in, the Lord who is strong and mighty, who is mighty in battle, who is the Lord of hosts and the King of glory. These things we should not guard from God. Beautiful, beautiful sentiment there in Psalm 24, and I hope that we take it to heart. I hope that we consider what kind of guards we have against God and consider how to remove those from our lives if we find them. We have one long psalm to kind of spend our time with here at the end, Psalm 37. Psalm 37. Let's go ahead and read Psalm 37 together. Simply, the title of it is Of David. He says, fret not yourself because of evildoers. Be not envious of wrongdoers. For they will soon fade like grass and wither like the herb of the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you your heart's desire. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he will act. He will bring forth your righteousness as the light, and your justice as the noonday. Be still before the Lord, and wait patiently for him. Fret not yourself over the one who prospers in his way, over the man who carries out evil devices. Refrain from anger, and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself, it tends only to evil. For the evildoer shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. In just a little while the wicked one will be no more. Though you look carefully at his place, he will not be there. But the meek shall inherit the land, and delight themselves in abundance of peace. The wicked plot against the righteous, and gnash his teeth at him. But the Lord laughs at the wicked, for he sees that his day is coming. The wicked draw a sword and bend their bows to bring down the poor and needy, to slay those who are upright. Their sword shall be in their own heart, and their bow shall be broken. Better is the little of the righteous than the abundance of many wicked. For the arm of the wicked shall be broken, but the Lord upholds the righteous. The Lord knows the days of the blameless, and their heritage will remain forever. They are not put to shame in evil times. In the days of famine they will have abundance. But the wicked will perish. The enemies of the Lord are like the glory of the pastures. They vanish. Like smoke they vanish away. The wicked borrows but does not pay back. But the righteous is generous and gives. But those blessed by the Lord shall inherit the land. But those cursed by him shall be cut off. The steps of a man are established by the Lord. When he delights in his ways, though he fall, he shall not be cast headlong, for the Lord upholds his hand. I have been young, and now am old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, for his children begging for bread. He is ever lending generously, and his children become a blessing. Turn away from evil and do good. So shall you dwell forever. For the Lord loves justice. He will not forsake his saints. They are preserved forever, but the children of the wicked shall be cut off. The righteous shall inherit the land and dwell upon it forever. The mouth of the righteous utters wisdom, and his tongue speaks justice. The law of God is in his heart. His steps do not slip. The wicked watch for the righteous to seek to put him to death. The Lord will not abandon him to his power, or let him be condemned when he is brought to trial. Wait for the Lord and keep his way. He will exalt you to inherit the land. You will look on when the wicked are cut off. I have seen a wicked, ruthless man spreading himself like green laurel trees. But he passed away, and behold, he was no more. Though I sought him, he could not be found. Mark the blameless, and behold the upright, for there is a future for the man of peace. But transgressors shall be altogether destroyed. The future of the wicked shall be cut off. The salvation of the righteous is from the Lord. He is their stronghold in the time of trouble. The Lord helps them and delivers them. He delivers them from the wicked and saves them, because they take refuge in him. David makes a lot of strong, definitive statements here in Psalm 37. And if, as we read through Psalm 37, you may have thought back to some of Israel's history, and you've wondered, how does all this fit in? We want to take a few moments and talk about that a little bit this evening. He begins there with the general assessment or the general comparison of ourselves to those who are wicked. Solomon is also going to wrestle with this idea over in Ecclesiastes. He wonders, why is it that some people in their evil prosper so much? And David doesn't answer of why, he just answers about how we should react to that. So there in verse 1 is, don't fret yourself because of evildoers, and don't be envious of wrongdoers. Don't do it. And there are some times that evil people are ludicrously wealthy. There are times where good, hardworking individuals who try to be honest are just scratching through with a small existence. They have barely anything, while their next door neighbor is dealing in corruption and live prosperously. I've been to places where literally that is, the example, where the average household income was closer to like $6,000 annually, and you would have a shack of corrugated steel nailed together to just some pieces of timber for individuals who try to be honest. And then their next door neighbor would have a small mansion because they were corrupt. I knew one Christian lady where she lived in a very nice house in a very, very poor neighborhood. And her husband knew the truth and wasn't willing to give up his false dealings, knowing that his wealth would go along with it. But he says for us, not to be envious of them. Maybe we don't have everything we want. Maybe we don't get to enjoy all of the pleasures that this life holds. But consider what he says in verse 2, that they will soon fade like grass and wither like a green herb. And that is the mildest of the things that he says in chapter 37 about the wicked. He gets back to our instruction in verse 3. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. One of the promises that were given in the nation of Israel, that if they do good, if they follow after God, that their dwelling in the land of Canaan was secure. That they wouldn't be raided, that they wouldn't have to be sent away into captivity, that they would not suffer those things. And David here is dealing with that promise. To some degree, there is some other fulfillments that we see later on in the New Testament as well. But on the surface of it, David's still dealing with that if you trust in the Lord and do good, then you can dwell in the land secure and befriend faithfulness. He says in verse 4, instead of delighting yourself in the abundance of other things or in the excess of worldly possessions, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. We mentioned this in Psalm 20, where David writes for the people for them to ask for the king, that God would give him the desires of his heart. That same phrase comes up here in another Psalm of David in Psalm 37. Now, the whole point of this is the connection between the two, is that the desire of the heart is predicated on that you delight yourself in the Lord. Which is what we talked about over in Matthew chapter 5 when Jesus opens up with the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, and they will be satisfied. That's what David's talking about here in Psalm 37. He is saying that if you delight yourself in the Lord will satisfy you with the great blessings of God. He isn't promising here great prosperity. He isn't promising that everyone gets to have $1 million in the bank account, or they don't all get to own their own private jet. What he's saying is that if you delight yourself in God, then he is going to be abundantly gracious to you and providing you the things that you are truly delighted in. Righteousness, sanctification, a wisdom from God. Those things come in abundance to those that is their delight. He tells them again in verse 5, commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he will act. That's one of the really interesting things here in Psalm 37, where he tells them again in verse 7 to be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. He then tells them again to wait for him to act. That's a really important thing. We see this sometimes in David's life. He mentions here later on, verse 37, or chapter 37, or Psalm 37, that he was young, now he's old. There were times where the nation of Israel went into battle without asking God, and it went terribly. And there were times that they went into battle with asking God, and it went wonderfully. And those differences were huge. There were times where the nation of Israel were leaving captivity and they come to the Red Sea and they ask of Moses, why did you bring us out here only to die in the wilderness, to be slaughtered by the Egyptian army? And the answer was, be still and wait for the Lord. Sometimes we fret ourselves over what we're going to do about it. And sometimes the answer is to commit our way to the Lord, to trust in him and let him act. He will bring forth your righteousness as the light and your justice as the noonday. So be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Fret not yourself over the one who prospers in his way and the man who carries out evil devices. And then he continues on in verse 8 to tell us to refrain from anger and forsake wrath and not to fret ourselves, because those three things only tend to evil. They don't produce the righteousness that God requires, as James tells us. And then he then gets back to the evildoer. For the evildoer shall be cut off. But for those who wait for the Lord, they shall inherit the land. And just a little while, the wicked will be no more. Though you look carefully for him, he will not be there. Here in verse 35, David, right towards the end, so you have verse 9, he says, this is what's going to happen. Verse 10, in a little while he'll be cut off, you're going to look, you won't find him. David in verse 35 says, I have seen the wicked, ruthless man, spreading himself like green laurel trees. And he passed away, and behold, he was no more, even though I sought him. The idea is not going to be the idea that, okay, now, you just watch the evil person, and in 2 days, that's it. The evil will stop and there'll be no more evil. And then once that person's dead, no more evil people ever arise. What he's dealing with is the grand scheme of things. What is the end of the things that they're doing? What is the end result of the way that they live? He mentions here that the Lord will establish us forever, that we shall inherit the land, that they shall dwell secure, that these blessings will pass on to the next generation. But as for the evildoer, they will be cut off. As for the wicked, he will be no more. The idea isn't that he will just cease to exist, but that his evil doing will end because he has to face the day of judgment. But he mentions here in verse 11, but the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in the abundance of peace. Again, this comes up in the Beatitudes, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 5. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Interesting how some of the ones we end up picking up this week all kind of come back and correlate to the Beatitudes. But we see that here, but Jesus kind of paraphrases this or repurposes this phrase in the Beatitudes, but the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in the abundance of peace. The wicked plot against the righteous and gnash their teeth at him. But in verse 13, the Lord laughs because he sees that their day is coming. Again, the idea being is not that God is going to stop every evil person before they have the chance to do evil, that their plans come to nothing. But what is it they're getting out of the life they're living? What is the end reward for the things that they're doing now? And the answer is not eternal salvation, it's eternal punishment. And the Lord sees that, and while this happens for a short time now, eternity in comparison is far, far greater. And so he mentions that the wicked draw their sword, they bend their bows, and they try to bring down the needy and the poor and the upright. But the sword shall enter their own heart, and their bow shall be broken. And then he gets back to this idea that he started with in verse 1 and verse 2, that better is the little that the righteous have than the abundance of many wicked. And again, the same thing as you get over into the book of Proverbs and the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon explores both of these ideas as well. That what is better, and the comparison that he gives here, is the little bit that the righteous has, even if it's not much. And even if it's as Jesus, who is homeless, or Paul, who is often without food and often in the cold and exposed, better than the abundance of many wicked. You know, what if you had not only just the wealth of Bill Gates, but the wealth of 10 Bill Gates? Is that worth trading? You know, if you were currently homeless, would that be worth trading your righteousness for the wealth of many wicked people? And a lot of people would probably jump at it. But he says it's better to have a little and to be righteous. The Lord knows the days of the blameless, and that their heritage will remain forever. As you deal with poetry, the terminology is not always precise in the sense that it is exactly what is intended, in the sense that the wicked will be cut off, that the wicked will cease to exist, or there be no more, that you cannot find them. That isn't literal in the sense that they will cease to exist and will never be there, and then in just a couple of days, in a short time, as we see a short time, that these things will cease. What he's dealing with there is the comparison to what the Lord does for the righteous, to what he does to the wicked. And what he does for the righteous here in verse 18 is that their heritage remains forever, that they will not be put to shame in an evil day. In the days of famine they will have abundance, but the wicked will perish, and the enemies of the Lord are like the glory of the pastures, and they just vanish. Now imagine a whole nation that David is talking to here in Psalm 37, who follows what he's talking about. What if that they were the righteous people of God that was promised, and the world around them was in a famine? What would God do? Well, he promised them what he would do, that if they were righteous, he would continue to send rain, that they would continue to have an abundance. And in fact, that's what David's going to be talking about later. He says, the wicked, they borrow, but they do not pay back. The righteous is generous and gives. The idea being that they probably also borrow and also give back. But not only that, but they're not the ones who are always takers. They're also the ones who just give. Not lending, but giving. For they are blessed by the Lord and shall inherit the land. But those who are cursed by him shall be cut off. And again, this isn't a random, you shall be blessed and you shall be cursed, I like you and not you. This is based on the actions that they chose that he speaks of earlier in chapter 37. He reminds them that the steps of the man are established by the Lord when he delights in his ways. Though the Lord establishes steps if you, out of your own free will, delight in the ways of God. Though he fall, he shall not be cast headlong, for the Lord shall hold his hand. That doesn't mean that just because you delight in God's way, and that the Lord establishes your way, that you never have the opportunity to fall, that you never sin, that you never transgress. But the point being that as long as your motivation is there, as long as your heart is still towards God, that even if you truly trip and fall, that you come back from it. It doesn't end at that point in time. And so David mentions here, I was young and now I'm old, and yet I'm not seen the righteous forsaken, or the children begging for food. For he lends generously, and the children become a blessing. That isn't saying that there aren't any times where one man doesn't have what he needs. That may have happened in your life, as it has happened in my life in the past, where whenever you need something, somehow it all works out. And I'm sure that you guys have stories, and as I have stories of times where you don't know where the next paycheck's going to come from, or where you're going to get enough to pay the next bill, even though you're trying to be diligent with your funds, and then just stuff happens that you didn't count on, and all of a sudden a refund check comes in from a place you didn't know about, or whatever the case may be. And that's what he's dealing with. I have yet to see the righteous being forsaken. And so he reminds him in verse 27 what to do. So turn away from evil and do good, and you shall dwell forever. For the Lord loves justice, and he will not forsake his saints. They are preserved forever, but the children of the wicked shall be cut off. And the perseverance of the saints is not the idea that he will never allow them to choose to do evil. Take any time that you want in any of the time in the Bible, and you find individuals who used to delight in God, who chose to do evil. And you have Nathan the prophet, who comes up against David, who wrote this psalm, who his heart was completely wrong from his own choices. But the idea of perseverance is that while the wicked are cut off, the saints are preserved, that God has their heritage, that God has a place for them to dwell secure with him forever. And so he mentions here that the righteous shall inherit the land and dwell upon it forever. That the mouth of the righteous utters wisdom, and his tongue speaks justice. Take some time in the prophets again and look at all the accusations and look at how often the lack of justice comes up. The nation of Israel had a law system that was unlike any other law system in the ancient Near East. In fact, it was a law system that was unlike any other law system ever created before Christianity. It was unique. It was not brought about by people just gathering together and coming up with a law system. It was given to them by God. And by them ruining that law system and abandoning justice, they are abandoning the light that God gave them to shine to the nations around them. So, how is it that you are to inherit the land? How is it this nation's going to dwell there forever? Well, let your mouth utter wisdom and your tongue speak justice. Let the law of the Lord dwell in your heart, and then his steps will not slip, in verse 31. The wicked, however, they watch for the righteous to seek to put him to death, but the Lord will not abandon him to his power or let him be condemned when he is brought to trial. Not that there has never been a righteous person who falls at the hand of the wicked. That isn't what David is saying. But what if you are cut down? I mean, Jesus deals with this in the Gospel of Luke. What if you are killed by a wicked person as a righteous person, and then you stand before God as a righteous person and are granted into heaven? And they then have to face the same God on the same day of judgment, and they have to answer for the death that's on their hands. That's what he's dealing with here. And that on the day of trial, they'll not be condemned. And that even though this wicked person plots to destroy this righteous person, he gets to go to heaven. I'm not saying that being murdered is a great thing. That is not at all what I'm saying. But I'm saying if that is the worst thing that ever happens to us, well, certainly the last worst thing that'll happen to us, then the wicked person hasn't done what they have hoped to do. That's his point. So wait for the Lord and keep his way, and he will exalt you to inherit the land. He will look on, and you will look on when the wicked are cut off. And then he repeats what we just looked at here in verse 35. I have seen a wicked and a ruthless man spreading himself like large green laurel trees, but he has passed away, and behold, he was no more. Though I sought him, he could not be found. Mark the blameless, and behold the upright, for there is a future for a man of peace. But the transgressors shall be altogether destroyed, and the future of the wicked shall be cut off. Jesus asked the question, what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? If you had the entire world, would it be worth exchanging your soul? David, in a much kind of smaller degree, is wrestling or is presenting those options to you here. The poverty of the righteous compared to the abundance of many wicked. The individuals here in verse 1 who prosper in their evil doing. How do we respond to that? He mentions here to watch the blameless and to watch the upright, because their future is secure. Their salvation here in verse 39, and the righteous is from the Lord. He is their stronghold in the time of trouble. This life, while to us, it's all we see, it's all we get to experience, is not that long compared to eternity. If we are poor here, if we struggle here, if we have hardship here, if we suffer at the hands of the unrighteous here, but if we have eternity with God, what's the comparison? We talk to our kids about this quite a lot, where one small moment of their day that is unpleasant or didn't go the way that they wanted to, we encourage them not to let that one small thing ruin everything else. Put it into perspective. How much great have we done today? How many good things have we got to do? How much did you enjoy playing with your friends today? Don't let this one small thing ruin your outlook of the entire thing. And our life is that way. Our life is that small section. And if we have a hard time here, but yet dwell secure with God in peace and abundance and prosperity, letting Him be our light for all eternity, this life would be but a small section of that. And that's what David is trying to get them to see. Don't fret yourself because of the evildoer, and don't be envious of the wrongdoer. Look at the things he says here. I want to kind of just reiterate a couple of these real quick, and then, well, we'll be done for tonight. Verse 3, trust in the Lord and do good. Verse 4, delight yourself in the Lord. Verse 5, commit your way to the Lord. Trust in Him. Verse 7, be still before the Lord and wait patiently for Him. Verse 8, refrain from anger and forsake wrath. He gives another quick checklist for us here in Psalm 37. What does it mean to dwell securely with God in His land forever? Or who gets to do that? Those who trust and do good, those who delight in Him, those who commit their way to Him, those who are still before Him and await for Him, those who refrain from anger and forsake wrath. What a great checklist for those who want to dwell securely with God. I hope this has been beneficial to you. I love these Psalms, Psalm 37, Psalm 24, and Psalm 20. I hope that they've been interesting to you as well. Please do give me some feedback, either if you want to continue with some Psalms or if you want to go to Proverbs. Either way, whatever your desire is, let me know, and hopefully we'll make a decision this week, and then we'll move on from there. I hope that things are going well for you guys. Hope you're staying safe. Really miss getting to meet with you on a regular basis. Hopefully this will be over sooner rather than later, and hope we get to see you soon. Good night.